Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 191, Second Order, Surprisingly Strong Archaic Bear. Two M3 type IFVs were approaching very fast in the middle of the dirt road. The two military vehicles looked like two metal beasts, crushing everything in their path. Regardless of whether it was large tree trunks or concrete parts, the M3 IFVs crushed everything in their path and continued their forward march, steadily demonstrating the great power of these machines to move in different types of environments and situations. Standing on a tree a little over 200 meters away, the beautiful and cold Shangguan Bingshui observed the battlefield for a moment, and her indifferent gaze could not help but shake slightly. The place was a mess, to say the least, and although she had heard the explosion from before and had also seen the flames burn part of the opposing forest, she definitely did not expect to encounter such a hell. Blood stained the ground. A crater over 200 meters in diameter stretched with what used to be part of the main road. Part of both sections of the forest had disappeared, turning into nothing more than a pile of loose dirt and jumbled rocks. But what surprised not only her, but also the two military men driving the M3 IFVs was undoubtedly the miserable condition of the Second Order Bear. The Second Order Bear had slaughtered nearly 20 people, and its overwhelming presence had caused 30 survivors to be unable to withstand the pressure, flee into the forest, and be slaughtered by other wild creatures. It did not matter if the weapon used was a pistol, light machine gun, heavy machine gun, or rifle. It did not matter if the ammunition used was normal or with high penetrating capability. The creature's defenses before them had reached the level where they could only despair. Even the explosion of about 20 grenades had only slightly wounded the beast. In fact, the wound had been so insignificant that it could almost be completely ignored. The only thing they had gotten in return had been the rage and unleashed power of the monster. However, now I don't know who the real monster is here. Shangguan Bingshui didn't know how to feel about it as she looked at the miserable condition of the Second Order Bear. The beast was so badly injured that it looked like it was about to collapse at any moment. But when she looked at Bai Zemin, she realized that the battle that had broken out here had been even fiercer than she thought. This was the first time since the apocalypse had begun that she had seen Bai Zemin in such a miserable condition. Even when she had practically saved his life in his first encounter and battle to the death against the First Order Blazing Beetle, he was not in such an unfavorable condition as he was now, with the exception of the burns on his feet that almost prevented him from walking. Bai Zemin's entire body was a mess at this point. Not only did he have a broken arm hanging uncontrollably at his side, but he also had a large gash on the right side of his face, which had it been just a little deeper or a little lower, his head could have been severed from his body and cut to pieces. All of him looked as if he had come out of a battle against gods and demons. Shangguan Bingshui scanned and analyzed the situation for 2 seconds before quickly shouting somewhat anxiously, "Move away." Quickly, Bai Zemin seemed to notice her as he quickly jumped back. Furthermore, Shangguan Bingshui was also sure that he had activated the skill that allowed him to control the blood, as the beast was trapped by its own blood as if it were firm iron chains trapping a small puppy. But she was aware that this could only last 1 second at most, so she hurriedly ordered in a voice brimming with leadership, "Fire." The two soldiers driving the M3 infantry fighting vehicle did not even hesitate, and as if they were receiving the order from an immediate superior, they started firing the 40mm cannons. Bang! 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 A burst of fire fell on the area where the Second Order Bear was trapped, just as the runes on its scorched body glowed brightly after a fierce roar. As the runes glowed, the mana surrounding and shaping the blood chains disappeared and the beast regained its freedom. However, that millisecond of time was enough to be engulfed in a burst of a dozen shots fired by the IFV's main cannons. Shangguan Bingshui did not stand idly by either. Taking advantage of the small amount of mana recovered during the time she was not fighting, she raised one hand to the sky and with her other hand holding her wand pointed to the spot where the beast was being bombarded. Ice spears. A dozen ice spears with a length of almost 3 meters shot out at full speed. After hitting the area, the freezing frost energy transformed the crater into an ice rink. Roar. A roar of fury, but mostly of fear and pain, shook everyone's eardrums. The two infantrymen did not dare to stop for a moment and continued firing the main cannons manually while the heavy machine guns started firing automatically at the indicated spot. Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and saw the Second Order Bear running off in the direction of the forest. At a glance, he managed to see huge bloody wounds all over the creature's body, and now part of its only remaining arm had been torn off. "Don't let it break away," Xietain shouted anxiously. He no longer had mana and his stamina had been greatly consumed, so there was no way he could continue fighting the same way he had been doing. Unfortunately, there was no way the soldiers, who were just normal unevolved humans, could follow the movements of such a terrifying beast as the second-order bear. Even being injured in such a way, and with its movement speed severely affected, the beast's agility was not something a normal existence could comprehend or follow. Swoosh! Shangguan Bingshui gritted her teeth and activated one of her skills called Frozen Slide as she charged forward. The ground beneath her feet froze for every step she took, which increased her agility and thus her movement speed by several points. Thanks to the beast having been severely wounded by Xietain in addition to having its stamina dangerously low and then receiving attacks from the 40mm cannons of the IFVs, Shangguan Bingshui's movement speed was enough to move deep into the forest and in no time catch up to the beast. The second-order bear's eyes flashed viciously in fear as it saw a human blocking its path. It wanted to run away. In its current condition, instinct and its low intelligence told it that if it stayed there it would definitely be killed by the iron machines. Without even thinking about it, the beast continued to advance with somewhat staggering steps and slashed with its claw with the intention of crushing the obstacle. Shangguan Bingshui turned pale. Even in such a miserable state, the beast was still so powerful that she did not dare to underestimate it in any way, so she directly spent her remaining 30 mana points to form a halberd before placing it in a defensive stance. Clang! The claw of the beast, which was practically out of stamina, didn't have as much power as before. Hitting the ice halberd, it could not destroy it immediately. Shangguan Bingshui's beautiful and charming face was so pale that it was scary. Her sweet red lips had no trace of blood on them due to the loss of 100% of her mana. At the same time, the strength of the second-order bear caused her internal organs to shake and a small trickle of red blood slid out from the corner of her mouth. Crack, crack. Crack spread across the ice halberd, but she endured her condition and cried out, "Xietain!" The sound of lightning was the answer she was waiting for. Like a ghost out of hell itself, bathed in blood, Xietain appeared just above the head of the terrifying beast and with a full twist of his body, his right leg firmly and fiercely struck the practically destroyed head of the monster. Bang! With a horrific bang, the head of the beast that had given them so much trouble and pain exploded into thousands of pieces. After the loss of mana that constantly protected its body, its defenses had collapsed, so Xietain's fierce kick that contained all his strength caused blood to splatter everywhere. At the same time, 3 orbs of soul power with different sizes came out of the beast's body. The smallest orb entered Shangguan Bingshui's body. The second larger orb flew into the forest and disappeared into the trees. As for the larger and brighter orb, it naturally entered Xietain's body. Shangguan Bingshui, Xietain, and Kai Jingyi received a similar message that flashed in their retinas. The only difference in the message was the additional stats obtained after absorbing the soul power acquired from a powerful enemy, but the 3 of them focused on one thing in particular. You have obtained the soul power of second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear, level 58. After what had been the worst battle to date, the nerves of the 3 people finally relaxed and a sigh of relief flew from their lungs. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 192, Comfort and Trust. As the beast's red blood splattered all over the floor with small pieces of broken skull and intermingled brain matter, Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui had never felt so relieved in all their lives. In fact, for the first time, they both felt that the messages magically flashing in their retina due to the existence of the soul record were not irritating. Even when they evolved to First Order, they had never felt so joyful. Such was the terror that a single second-order beast had managed to inflict on their bodies and into their minds. Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui were aware that if they both really wanted to, they could at least have a great chance of escaping when the second-order bear was entertaining unleashing a one-sided massacre on the other survivors. However, at the same time, neither of them could do such a thing. Although their motives were different, the result in the end was the same. Shangguan Bingshui could not do such a thing not only because her 2 childhood friends were in the forest, but even though she was cold, she could not really just abandon to their fate people who had somehow or other entrusted their lives to her. Sometimes, the coldest people were those with the warmest feelings. Maybe this was a vivid example of that proverb. As for Zemin, he had two simple reasons why he had not retreated regardless of Lilith's warning. 1. He did not wish to see all his effort crushed just like that. He had worked harder than anyone could imagine to get to where he was and gather people willing to work for him in the midst of all this hell. 2. If he fled, Zemin felt indistinctly that he would lose something too important. As for what that was, he did not know. Besides, if he had to run away once, then he would definitely have to run away twice in the future. And if on one of those occasions he was not allowed to run away? What would he do then? Therefore, Zemin preferred to become stronger at the cost of risking his life a little. After all, he didn't think he would die. That way, he could absorb some of the soul power of someone far stronger than him and gradually prepare himself for those moments of real danger when he didn't even know if he would get out of a situation alive or not. You have obtained the soul power of second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear, level 58. You have received strength plus 86, agility plus 75, stamina plus 62, health plus 41, mana plus 41, magic plus 59. You have leveled up and reached level 41. You gain 2 status points to distribute freely. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. You have leveled up. You have leveled up and reached level 45. You gain 2 status points to distribute freely. Although Zemin had not absorbed all of the second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear's soul power, just a portion was enough to raise his overall stats to new heights. Even he was very surprised. You should know that the soul power of the second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear that Zemin, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Kai Jingyi had absorbed was not all the soul power they could have obtained if they had not used modern weapons. In fact, the only reason Kai Jingyi was rewarded with a portion of the soul power available by the soul record was probably because although she had used external weaponry, the strategy, the risk, the finding the perfect opportunity for attack was all done by herself. Kai Jingyi's situation was completely different from those survivors who just raised a modern firearm and shot at a distant enemy. To say that she had earned the additional stat increase was by no means an exaggeration. Not only with his part he managed to gain so many stats, but his level shot straight up to 45 in one step. According to Lilith, many people couldn't even level up after spending months or years. After all, 95% of living beings hunted enemies of the same level or lower, slowly accumulating soul power until the soul record pushed them to the next level. This was the safest and most popular evolutionary path. Therefore, the fact of going up so many levels or leveling up so fast constantly was not something normally seen, and only a privileged few were able to achieve such feats. Of course, a privileged few in comparison to the entire living existence. These privileged few actually numbered in the hundreds of millions. After all, the universe was simply too vast and the number of existing worlds was simply uncountable. When the additional stats were absorbed into his soul, Zemin felt himself becoming much stronger, and from the look of pleasant surprise in Shangguan Bing Shui's blue eyes, she was experiencing the same evolutionary process as him. What gave Zemin the most satisfaction was when his health stat increased a few dozen points. This was due to his current condition. Zemin slowly let the air in his lungs out as he slowly sat down on the floor. Without a care in the world, he simply laid down smoothly on the ground and his blank stare looked up at the sky. His whole body hurt so much that no one would ever be able to understand it unless they experienced it for themselves. The bones in his left arm had broken into no less than 20 or 30 pieces, and now that he was more relaxed and calm, he realized that he had 3 broken ribs. As if this were not enough, his face itched and hurt badly. He unconsciously reached out his hand to touch his face, but Shangguan Bing Shui stopped him as she calmly looked at him. "Don't touch it." Seeing him looking at her, she explained, "You narrowly missed losing an eye. I guess your health statistic is very high since even to the naked eye I can see how the tissues are moving slowly. I assume it won't be long before the wound disappears completely. Well, I guess with almost 300 points of health it's normal for my recovery to be monstrous." Zemin thought silently before letting his hand fall to the ground again. Shangguan Bing Shui also sat down on the ground not far from where Zemin was. The two of them remained silent. Neither of them had the energy to even care to see if they had gained anything from the death of the second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear. She didn't notice that even though there was barely half a meter of distance, she didn't feel particularly uncomfortable. Maybe it was fatigue, who knows? Bai Zemin did not realize that he was unconsciously beginning to trust Shangguan Bingshui more, or else he would never allow himself to collapse in such a way, apparently unable to protect himself. Maybe it was fatigue, who knows? On the other side of the forest, Lilith in her human form sighed in relief, and a proud smile appeared on her face as she saw Bai Zemin and the Ice Princess sitting a short distance away from the lifeless corpse of the Second Order, surprisingly strong archaic bear. Not bad, she thought. Her heart was overflowing with indescribable joy, not only because of the hard-fought and previously seemingly impossible victory. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 193: External Beauty and Internal Beauty. A total of about 20 minutes passed, and both Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui remained silent. Both rested quietly, trying to recover as much energy as possible as quickly as possible. Although both, he and she, had leveled up at least once after absorbing the soul power of the Second Order, surprisingly strong archaic bear, recovering 100% of the stamina and mana consumed during the battle, the fatigue that seemed to come from deep within their souls was not something that the soul record could casually fix just by leveling up a couple of times. The strain that Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui faced during the battle against their first Second Order enemy had reached such a level that while fighting they consumed more stamina than they normally would. Can we win? Can we survive? What will happen to the rest? What about my near and dear ones? All these and many more were questions that both he and she faced constantly, every second, and every minute that passed. Bai Zemin was no different from Shangguan Bingshui in that sense. After all, while he was confident of at least not dying even if he ended up seriously injured, the reality was that he had no confidence in coming out victorious either. Being completely honest with himself, Bai Zemin believed that he would be able to chase away the Second Order, surprisingly strong archaic bear. As for killing it, such a thing never crossed his mind. However, adding the two M3 IFVs to the equation changed everything. Furthermore, if it weren't for the fact that Bai Zemin had saved up over 60 free status points to distribute to any of his overall stats, increasing his strength enough to threaten the Second Order, surprisingly strong archaic bear, he definitely wouldn't have been able to fight for so long. Fortunately, lightning movement didn't run out in the middle of combat, or else it would have been a problem to tell if that damn bear's head exploded or mine would be the one that ended up exploding later. Bai Zemin couldn't help but rejoice out loud. The Second Order surprisingly strong archaic bear's agility stat was undoubtedly high. High to the point where it could stand on equal footing against Bai Zemin with lightning movement activated. This meant that if he lost the great increase in agility and thus movement speed of lightning movement, Bai Zemin would definitely have died. Therefore, the battle was to be concluded in 5 minutes at the most. Shangguan Bingshui slowly opened her eyes as she heard the man's muttering a short distance away. Without looking at him, she calmly asked, "Lightning movement is the name of that skill that allows you and Kai Jingyi to make clones and boost your agility abruptly?" If it was in the past, Bai Zemin would definitely not answer anything that had to do with his skills to Shangguan Bingshui. However, after the battle they had just faced, things were a bit different. Not only was it partly thanks to her existence that he managed to win and was not forced to despair, but even when he was in such a miserable condition she did not seem to have any intention of betraying him either. That being said, Bai Zemin's overall power at this time was perhaps, at best, 40% of his maximum total. This was because not only had he lost mobility in one arm, but his entire body hurt so much that even the slightest movement brought him hellish suffering. After all, the Second Order surprisingly strong archaic bear had hit practically his entire body, and even if it hadn't broken all his bones, Bai Zemin was sure that if he took off his clothes he would see his body covered in ugly contusions. Besides, the question she had asked was not particularly private, nor did it reveal crucial information. Therefore, Bai Zemin did not think too much about it and answered, "That's right. Lightning movement is my strongest movement skill. It's the same skill that Kai Jingyi has." "I see." She nodded. Although she was curious as to how it was possible for two people to acquire such a powerful movement skill practically at the same time, she decided not to ask too much. After all, everyone had their own secrets. After a moment of silence, Bai Zemin grunted softly and struggled to stand up. His face tightened slightly at the pain and itching he felt all over. Lilith had explained to him previously that this was the result of his body recovering from deep wounds at surprisingly high speeds, so he did his best to ignore that discomfort. It will probably take you about a week to heal that wound on your face. Shangguan Bingshui seemed to have rested enough as she also stood up while looking him in the face. A week? Bai Zemin was surprised. Soon, however, he forced a smile and asked, "So bad is it?" She, having seen the speed at which he recovered in the past from his battle against the First Order Blazing Beetle, should be aware of how high his recovery speed was. But even then she said such words. Shangguan Bingshui said nothing and instead extended her palm forward. A faint icy mist gathered around it and soon a small ice sliver formed on her hand. "You look at it." She handed the ice mirror to him. "That skill is really convenient." Bai Zemin wanted to chuckle but didn't dare for fear of making his wound worse. Seeing his reflection in the ice, Bai Zemin secretly sighed and his heart filled with lingering fear. There was a long cut on his face. From the chin on the right side to the bottom of the eye he saw a large bloody wound of not too pleasant appearance. Apart from the red flesh, Bai Zemin could also see in several parts the white bones of his own skull. "You really were lucky," Shangguan Bingshui pointed out. She looked at him with the same indifferent expression as always and her eyes did not seem particularly displeased by the sight. 1 or 2 more centimeters could have cost you your life. Bai Zemin was silent before nodding. Indeed, death had been closer than he thought. Even with his high health, it would take him at least 4 or 5 days to recover, and to avoid a scar he would probably need Kong Lan to use lesser healing on the wound once or twice. Forget it. Bai Zemin shook his head and looked at her before saying with a bit of surprise, "But I'm surprised that you can still keep your composure even seeing me like this." Forget that women were delicate and not too fond of ugly things, even he himself was a bit scared when he saw his own reflection. However, the woman before him did not even have a visible reaction to the naked eye, which was surprising and made him curious. Shangguan Bingshui shrugged and said something that surprised Bai Zemin even more. "At the end of the day, you and I are made of flesh and blood. You lost the layer that embellishes a little and covers the ugliness of our bodies. Besides, I stopped caring about things like external beauty when I was young. I'd rather worry more about whether a person has a trustworthy soul or whether under so much beauty he or she is actually hiding an evil being." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 194, Green Orb, Epic Grade Treasure. Bai Zemin was silent, pondering over the words Shangguan Bingshui had just spoken. To say he was not surprised would be a lie. Shangguan Bingshui was about 1 or 2 years older than him, her background was also not normal or else she could not be childhood friends with people like Chen He and Wu Yijun who were deeply connected with the Chinese army or government. However, the words she had just said seemed to come from deep in her heart and not just nice words that were spoken to act mature. So what kind of life did a 22 or 23 years old girl have to live to say words that were usually spoken by middle-aged or even elderly people? Bai Zemin did not know nor did he think it was polite to ask about other people's personal lives. Although the confidence between the two was gradually growing, it was just a step and he did not believe that such a thing was something of direct interest to him anyway. Therefore, after staying silent for a couple of seconds, he simply nodded. "I see. Won't you see what's over there?" Shangguan Bingshui pointed at the limp, lifeless body of the Second Order, surprisingly strong archaic bear. Bai Zemin, not feeling like lingering too long on the previous conversation, looked at the corpse of the Second Order beast with shining eyes. His heart began to beat uncontrollably at the thought of the war spoils he might have obtained this time. Even if the Second Order, surprisingly strong archaic bear was slightly injured by the grenades and in the end was wounded quite a bit by the main cannons of the 2 M3 IFVs, there should at least be something good, right? Bai Zemin thought silently. No matter how you put it, a Second Order beast was a Second Order beast. Moreover, one that had been miserably beaten and killed by an existence several levels lower and a completely lower order. Walking towards the body of the dead beast with slow steps due to the pain he felt in every part of his body, Bai Zemin soon noticed something that made him audibly swallow saliva. This is," he mumbled dumbfoundedly in surprise to Shangguan Bingshui. She walked forward and stopped beside him. Her pretty sky-colored eyes sparkled with a hint of surprise and she whispered to herself, "Green?" A faint green glow shone and flashed faintly right next to the body of the second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear. The object was perfectly circular, like a natural diamond sphere, something no man could replicate. According to Lilith, the treasure orbs naturally born from the enemy soul power that could not be absorbed were divided into a scale of 7 levels. As for the orb before Xietain's eyes, it was actually a green orb. Ranked 4th among the 7 from the bottom up, the green-colored treasure orb represented an epic-grade treasure. To say that Xietain was incredibly excited and joyful would be an understatement of how he was feeling at this very moment. However, a doubt soon popped into his mind. Why? While it was amazing what he had just accomplished, defeating a being countless times more powerful than him, Xietain did not believe that a treasure of such a grade should have appeared here. Don't overthink it. Lilith's enchanting voice rang in his head, clearing his doubts like a warm spring breeze clearing the autumn dew. The treasures of the soul record are generated according to the difference in actual enemy power. That is, the greater the enemy's soul power compared to yours, the greater the chances of obtaining a high-ranked treasure. A second-order existence is, as you may have already noticed, an existence that even you cannot face yet. But even then you killed one. Probably the soul record wanted to reward you for your achievement? Who knows? Xietain finally understood everything. Simply put, the appearance of treasures coming from the soul record did not depend on whether an enemy was of high order or not, it depended on the difference in power. This meant that even a 4th order being would not necessarily give even a normal grade red orb if they were killed by an enemy of their own order, and would definitely give nothing if they were killed by a higher order one. Indeed. The second order surprisingly strong archaic bear should not have died here. Even Lilith still could not calm the astonishment that struck her heart as she stared at the bear's lifeless body from the distance. The difference in power between a first-order existence and a second-order existence was as great as the difference between a normal human being and a human being who had already become a first-order existence and with several advanced levels within that order. It was like comparing the past Xietain with him after advancing to first order and reaching level 30. That was how great and horrifying the difference between the first order and the second order was. Come on, pick it up. Shangguan Bing Shui urged. He looked at her and hesitated a little. While it was true that almost all of the work had been handled by him, the reality was that Xietain knew very well that if it weren't for her, the enemy could have killed him at worst or fled at best. As for killing it, Xietain would not have been able to do it. At that point not only had he lost over 90% of his mana, but he had also consumed approximately 70 to 80% of his stamina due to the constant activation of blood, will and the intense battle. The wounds on his body did not help and there were less than 60 seconds left before the effect of his lightning movement skill vanished, leaving him at the mercy of the beast's superior agility. Shangguan Bing Shui understood his thoughts and secretly couldn't help but have her impression of him greatly improved. Just take it. We can talk about the loot and similar later. She simply waved her hand as if it was nothing. All right then. Xietain nodded and took a step forward before picking up the green orb the size of a baby's fist. Swoosh. With a firm squeeze, the crack spread across the orb, letting out a luminous white light that forced both of them to close their eyes momentarily. Xietain felt a new object appear in his hand, and when he and she opened their eyes again, they finally saw with surprise the treasure that had emerged from the green orb. The object was surprisingly a strange-looking gun, a weapon in the shape of a gun that neither of the two of them had ever seen before. It looked like a sci-fi gun out of a movie or animation. The size of the gun was roughly similar to a 9mm pistol, but slightly larger. Its color was deep navy blue, and instead of a muzzle it had a thin 2mm wide line on the front whose color was milk white as was the trigger. What caught Xietan's attention the most was that on the part where the bottom of the magazine was supposed to be, there was actually a strange crystalline-colored sphere with mysterious moving particles of light. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 195 Infinite Reduction, Epic Grade Treasure. Xietain and Shangguan Bing Shui unconsciously looked at each other. They both saw the complicated glance in each other's eyes. Never in their lives had they ever seen a kind of weapon similar to the one he held in his hands. Just based on its futuristic appearance alone, it was definitely many years ahead of mankind's current technology. Shangguan Bing Shui could not contain her curiosity about the weapon. She put her delicate hand on the top of the weapon and wished to know its description and details. Bai Zemin also did the same as her, and a series of green words flashed in both of their retinas. Infinite reduction, epic grade treasure, shoot a beam capable of reducing non-moving objects or lifeless creatures. The power depends on the energy administered through soul stones. The higher the grade and purity of the soul stone, the more objects it can reduce and the higher its order or level. Consumes 1 soul megacyclone of energy per day to keep objects in a reduced size state. Generates 2 soul megacyclone of energy every 24 hours. Current soul megacyclone 0/500000. Note, the weight of objects is reduced by half regardless of the total size reduction. A weapon capable of reducing objects. Bai Zemin's heart pounded against his chest so hard that it seemed to threaten to want to escape at any moment due to the excitement. Infinite reduction had several limitations despite its extremely powerful name. For example, it did not work against moving objects and was also useless against living beings. However, Bai Zemin was not worried about any of this in the least. After all, an epic-grade treasure could not be all-powerful. But even with such limitations that practically put the use of infinite reduction in real combat out of the question, this treasure was so precious to Bai Zemin that it was priceless. That's right. Even if it was not a combat-useful treasure, and even if it did not even grant a mere statistic, this treasure was from a certain point of view even more valuable than all the treasures Bai Zemin had acquired so far. With infinite reduction, Bai Zemin would finally be able to reduce the size of his items and carry them much more easily. Although he didn't have a spatial storage treasure as Lilith did, with this treasure his entire life had suddenly become thousands of times lighter and easier. What an incredible treasure. It really is worthy of the word epic. Shangguan Bingshui sighed. She was naturally aware of how precious such a weapon capable of reducing the size of objects was, especially for a faction in the midst of formation. Now it would no longer be necessary that every time monsters appeared they would have to move hundreds of survivors to take care of the corpses. They could simply reduce the size, load them into a vehicle, and take them to the beginning village where the survivors could work more comfortably and much safer. Events similar to today's, where an extremely powerful enemy existence massacred more than a dozen people directly or indirectly, would probably never happen again. At the very least, the probability of such a thing happening had been greatly reduced. Bai Zemin could no longer keep calm and for a moment seemed to forget the pain in his body and his wounds. He circled around the body of the second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear to see if it had dropped any other items. He was definitely not willing to leave anything behind regardless of how worthless it was. Besides, neither he nor Shangguan Bingshui believed that treasures coming from a being as powerful as the second order, surprisingly strong archaic bear were of little value. Infinite reduction was a clear example of this. Unfortunately, even after circling the body several times, neither Bai Zemin nor Shangguan Bingshui managed to find a second item. I guess that's it. Bai Zemin looked resigned. Shangguan Bingshui didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She observed, "We just obtained a treasure of such magnitude. It would have seemed even stranger to me if there were more things of such a grade." Bai Zemin thought about it for a moment and finally his spirit lifted. Indeed, she was right. He shouldn't be so greedy. With his mood improved by what Shangguan Bingshui said, Bai Zemin scrubbed his hands maniacally in his mind and said aloud, "Let's test how well this baby works." Shangguan Bingshui said nothing and advanced towards the almost completely crushed head of the monster. An ice dagger appeared in her hand and after a light search, her eyes sparkled with joy and surprise as she touched something hard between the middle of the destroyed brain. "There really is one," she exclaimed happily, losing her coolness momentarily. In his fist, to Bai Zemin's delight, was a second-order soul stone. This was the first time he or she had ever seen a second-order soul stone, and its value was undoubtedly immeasurable. Who knew how long it might be before he or she would see a second one again? To avoid breaking precious items, Bai Zemin had left his backpack hidden in the forest, so he didn't even have a single soul stone with him at the moment. But even then, he was unwilling to use this soul stone as an experiment. Wait a moment, let's see how these work first. Shangguan Bingshui clearly didn't want to waste such a precious soul stone just like that either. Without saying a word more, she rummaged through her bag for a moment and soon pulled out a few dozen unclassified soul stones from inside. Bai Zemin picked up one unclassified soul stone and, while he didn't quite know how infinite reduction worked, one didn't have to be a genius to figure it out. He brought the soul stone close to the bottom where the strange crystal sphere was located, and soon the white light particles inside began to glow brightly. The unclassified soul stone soon seemed to respond as it too began to glow with a faint pale white glow that quickly became brighter and brighter. After 2 or 3 seconds, the soul stone in Bai Zemin's hand had disappeared as if it had vanished into thin air. Infinite reduction, epic grade treasure, current soul megacyclone, 10/5000000. 10 soul megacyclone, huh? Bai Zemin muttered under his breath. He didn't know how the soul megacyclone thing worked. He also didn't know how much energy a soul stone could give depending on the level or order the monster or creature it belonged to before it was killed. As for this, both Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bing Shui were helpless and could only continue to test. Bai Zemin consumed a total of 40 unclassified soul stones to do some testing. Although he could not get much information out of it, what he obtained was enough to make him happy. The unclassified soul stones that he and Shangguan Bing Shui were using were naturally the soul stones that belonged to the wolf spiders that were slaughtered inside the forest. Those wolf spiders were not the exact same level even though they were the same type of monster, which was completely normal. With levels hovering around level 5 and level 10, the soul stones could be of higher quality or lower quality. However, to the surprise and relief of both of them, it didn't matter which soul stone they used. All 40 soul stones gave exactly 10 soul megacyclone each. Infinite reduction now has a total of 500 soul megacyclone. Shangguan Bing Shui pointed as she looked at her bag. I don't have any more soul stones left here. I think we should check how much energy it takes to reduce the second order bear's body to manageable levels for us. Bai Zemin nodded in agreement. If 500 soul megacyclone wasn't enough to reduce the beast's size to something manageable, then this treasure was trash. No matter how valuable the infinite reduction skill was, if the consumption was too high, then there was no point in using it. After all, soul stones were extremely precious and valuable. Bai Zemin was not willing to waste too many since in the future these items would be the main source of energy in the world. The more he obtained in the early stages, the better it would be for him and his faction's development in the future when things became more grim. Bai Zemin pointed the gun at the second order bear, but before he had a chance to press the trigger, a tiny glass window appeared at the back of the gun. Because it had previously been turned off, Bai Zemin had thought it was just some sort of decoration, but now he realized how naive his thinking had been. How could such a technologically advanced and magically operated weapon have unnecessary parts? Target, second order surprisingly strong archaic bear, size reduction to 10 centimeters, 50 soul megacyclone. Seeing the message on the small crystal screen, Bai Zemin let out a small sigh of relief. Fortunately, the consumption had not reached a scary level. If all the unclassified soul stones regardless of the level of the killed beast gave a total of 10 soul megacyclone each, then this meant that to reduce the size of a second-order beast, a total of 5 unclassified soul stones would be needed. A lot of testing still needed to be done, but temporarily that was all Shangguan Bing Shui and Bai Zemin could do about it. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 196 Special Formula, Magic Gunpowder. After confirming the power consumption required to reduce the 4-meter-tall second-order, surprisingly strong archaic bear to 10 centimeters, Bai Zemin decided to test the power of the treasure he had acquired. Swoosh! As he pulled the trigger of infinite reduction lightly while aiming at the lifeless beast, a violet-colored beam shot out from the tip of the weapon. Rather than a beam, Bai Zemin thought it looked more like a kind of scanner like the eye scanners seen in movies where the retina was analyzed by a softly moving light. After the violet beam of light seemed to scan the entire body of the second-order, surprisingly strong archaic bear, it simply disappeared. At the same time as the beam of light slowly faded away, the creature's body began to become smaller and smaller. 3 meters, 2 meters, 1 meter. Under Shangguan Bing Shui's bright eyes and Bai Zemin's excited glance, the giant body began to get smaller and smaller at surprisingly high speeds. In just 5 seconds, the body the size of a large house had now become a small toy 10 centimeters tall. What is this? Bai Zemin soon noticed something strange. Right where one of the beast's legs had been, an object lay on the ground. It was probably being blocked by the second-order bear's body. Shangguan Bingshui analyzed and stepped forward to pick up the object. The object appeared to be something similar to a sheepskin. But the most surprising thing was that there were several runes engraved on all over the sheepskin. In Shangguan Bingshui's retina flashed the description and details of the object. Magic gunpowder formula, black fire sulfur blood with poisonous properties, carbon soul stone. Shangguan Bingshui had a confused look on her face. She said nothing and simply passed the sheepskin to Bai Zemin for him to see with his own eyes. After reading the contents of the small sheepskin scroll, Bai Zemin did not know what to say about it. Gunpowder was a well-known substance long before the soul record appeared on Earth. But this was the first time he or she had come across a formula for creating magic powder. The gunpowder was extremely frightening. Its destructive power was absolutely unquestionable. So, the so-called magic powder should definitely be countless times more powerful and special, even more so considering its ingredients. Black fire sulfur? Neither Bai Zemin nor Shangguan Bingshui knew where on earth they could obtain such a thing. Sulfur? Sure, but black fire sulfur? Such a thing definitely did not exist on Earth before the arrival of the soul record on this planet. As for the rest of the ingredients, they were much simpler ingredients. Blood with poisonous properties was quite easy to acquire. In fact, Bai Zemin had killed several mutated and evolved snakes before leaving the university grounds back then. He just needed to keep the blood as it was without purifying it, and he could easily obtain several liters. Carbon could be found in many factories, there was no need to worry too much about it. He just had to find the right city and clean the monsters inside. As long as they were not unlucky, the group would not encounter monsters that were too powerful. As for soul stones, these could only be obtained by killing enemies. There was no other way. Let's just keep this for now. Bai Zemin shook his head and put the sheepskin scroll away carefully. It will probably be extremely useful to us in the future. Shangguan Bingshui nodded silently and did not comment on the matter. Today it had been proven that mankind's weapons would gradually become ineffective against the evolved monsters. It took a concentrated bombardment of 2 M3 IFEs, more than 20 shots, to force an already severely wounded second-order beast to retreat. You should know that such weapons had enough power to crush entire iron fortresses. Although Shangguan Bingshui did not believe that there were many beings with the terrifying power that the bear had used, it had only been a little over 20 days since the eruption of the apocalypse. She was fairly certain that as time passed, second-order existences would no longer be a rarity as zombies were at the moment, and when such a thing happened, mankind should have the power to deal with them. If humans failed to evolve not only their individual power, but also their weaponry and technology, then the entire human race would probably disappear from existence in the not necessarily distant future. Although the second-order, surprisingly strong archaic bear's size had been reduced to just 10 centimeters from its original 4 meters thanks to the power of infinite reduction, its weight had actually only been reduced by half. With Bai Zemin injured and his left arm out, he could barely use 30 to 40% of his total strength, and if he pushed himself too hard he could open up the wounds that had already begun to heal thanks to his high health stat. Therefore, with great care, he and Shangguan Bingshui moved the beast's body onto an ice cart that she laboriously crafted. Although Shangguan Bingshui's ice maker skill allowed her to make practically anything, in reality it was more focused on simple things. Therefore, to make an ice cart she consumed practically 90% of her total mana in a very short time. By the time he and she emerged from the opposite forest, the 2 soldiers driving the 2 M3 IFEs were waiting for them outside with anxious hearts. It had been almost an hour since the 2 had entered the forest on the other side of the main road without coming out. The soldiers did not dare to go into those unexplored lands by any means. Even with 2 machines as powerful as the M3 IFEs, they did not feel safe. When they saw them leave, they both relaxed, and soon the group of 4 moved back to the central part of the forest opposite the forest where the bear had been killed. Kai Jingyi and Zhong De practically dashed toward Bai Zemin when they saw him. The duo was shocked to see his horrible condition. This was the second time they had seen Bai Zemin receive such gruesome injuries. Another proof of how horrendously strong was the enemy which they had managed to survive thanks to him. While his two trusted subordinates supported him, Shangguan Bingshui was immediately assaulted by Qinhe and Wu Yijuan, who began asking questions and checking her condition. "I'm fine, don't worry about me. The only injured person is Bai Zemin, he was the one who fought hand-to-hand against the second-order bear." Shangguan Bingshui shook her head and looked at the man who was now resting with Lily beside him, who to her surprise, was completely unconcerned about the terrifying bloody wound on his face. This made her impression of Lily unconsciously improve. Shangguan Bingshui could be indifferent and unconcerned about Bai Zemin's current appearance, but this was because she had a special passive skill due to past events that marked her current personality. Therefore, she was surprised to see how another woman, and a weak and powerless one at that, could still look at him with the same look as always even when his face was at very least 40% disfigured. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 197 Post-Battle. Because of what had happened, Bai Zemin gave the order to rest. The sun had already begun to set on the distant horizon, and staying in the forest without any protection during the night was no different from suicide for normal survivors. The survivors were still persistently frightened because of what had happened about an hour ago. None of them felt safe, and their fear-filled eyes scanned the surroundings cautiously, as no one knew when a second terrifying bear like the previous one might jump out of the shadows. Most of them had never seen the real power of Bai Zemin, and very few had seen him eliminate first-order beasts or other powerful creatures. However, there were a few who had seen him at his peak, and seeing his current injuries only made the despair in their hearts grow even greater. This was probably going to continue this way, since they had not yet seen the body of the second-order bear. But when they could see the even more miserable condition in which the beast's corpse ended up, they would probably feel some relief and comfort. In the heart of the forest, military base, those in charge of the kitchen began to prepare dinner immediately. Although the previous commander of this base took many kitchen utensils with him for obvious reasons, there were still many that were left behind. Therefore, Bai Zemin had ordered the messenger who returned to the beginning village to tell Kai Jingyi and Zhongde that there was no need to bring pots and pans or anything like that. When dinner was served, the hard-working survivors began to devour with fervor. None of them knew if they could survive another day, considering where they were. At least they wanted to die with their stomachs feeling satisfied and not roaring with hunger. While these people's dinner was simply rice and meat with a steamed bun, without too much luxury and without too much variety, none of the survivors had the slightest complaint in their minds. They all ate with joy shining in their eyes, because these people were aware of how cruel and painful it was to experience hunger. That feeling of helplessness that devours the bones little by little, the awareness that there was nothing they could do about it, the feeling of the strength of their bodies leaving them little by little, all this was something that could not be understood by those who never suffered or experienced great hardships in their lives. Moreover, although the dinner was simple, the meat they were eating was actually mutated beast meat. The mutated beast meat was filled with nutrients capable of improving the human body. It gave a few permanent stats to those who were weaker, and its blood was able to quickly replenish the energy they had lost after a day of hard work and filled with heavy and dark emotions. At one of the tables in the military dining room, the main leaders of the group as well as the armed soldiers were having their own dinner. First-order snake soup, small pies stuffed with first-order wild boar meat, noodles with different kinds of sauces, and so on. It was certainly a much more varied dinner than that of the normal survivors. However, everyone was aware of the rules of the group. Those who fought had the highest priority. The armed men were devouring their bowls voraciously. Even they could not enjoy this kind of treatment very often. Only the leaders could eat this kind of thing whenever they felt like it. Bai Zemin had already showered and currently had his left arm resting on a bandage that went around his neck. Although it wasn't much, it was better than having his arm hanging carelessly. Even with his current health, he would need 2 or 3 more days to recover from such injuries unless he received magical medical treatment. The wound on his face had not bled for a long time. Tissues moved slowly and steadily, repairing those that were damaged, while cells worked overtime to shape new tissues to replace those that had been completely destroyed. Are you okay?" Qinhe asked as he looked at him with complicated eyes. He had noticed a strange closeness between Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui after they returned from the forest victorious. It was not a romantic closeness by any means, but Qinhe noticed a kind of harmony and calmness between the two. Something like this was hard to expect since considering the similar personalities that Shangguan Bing Shui and Bai Zemin had, the most normal thing would be to expect a big disagreement between the two. This puzzled and worried Chen He a little. However, he was also genuinely worried about Bai Zemin's health. After all, Bai Zemin was a battle colleague with whom he had been through a lot over the past few weeks, and while he secretly saw him as a kind of rival, he felt no hatred of any kind towards him. "I'm fine." Bai Zemin nodded as he took a piece of roast meat with his chopsticks and savored it slowly to prevent the wound on his face from worsening again. "When we return to the village tomorrow, I will have Kong Lan use her skill on me. I assume that in 3 days, maximum 4, I'll be back to my best condition. It's really a pity that Kong Lan didn't come. Otherwise, she could start treating you now." Wu Yijuan lamented as she imagined the pain Bai Zemin must have been enduring silently. She didn't think such wounds didn't hurt at all. "That's why we should finish everything here and return tomorrow at dawn." Shangguan Bing Shui calmly interjected. Chen He hesitated for a moment before asking, "Doesn't it hurt?" He simply could not understand how Bai Zemin was not even blinking. Just imagining the pain of suffering such injuries made Chen He shudder slightly. Bai Zemin was about to take another piece of first-order beast meat into his mouth, but upon hearing Chen He's question his movements automatically stopped. He looked at the talented young marksman as if he was looking at an idiot. "What do you think?" he asked rhetorically and then rolled his eyes. "Stop being a sissy and eat. Isn't it just some pain? No need to make a big deal out of it." How could he not feel pain? It was just that Bai Zemin had been injured on more than one occasion during his constant fights, and sometimes they were tremendously painful injuries. It had gotten to the point where even the pain was no longer as horrendous as it was in the past. Chen He shook his head and did not ask any more questions. He simply could not understand because he had only received superficial injuries so far, and the worst wound he had suffered had been a gunshot on the arm when he had confronted the armed men of the village that now belonged to them. The group dined calmly, some of them worried about the future, others worried about the present, others missing the past. But they all knew that the only choice they had was to keep moving forward without rest. The appearance of the second-order bear had been a harsh wake-up call for all of them. It was a warning that told them to not forget something important. The era of peace and tranquility where the laws of society protected them had long since ended. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 198 Return to the Village. In the middle of the main road on the way to the north of Yanqing district, a convoy of about 30 vehicles was moving at a steady speed. This convoy was quite unique in that there were not only jeeps, buses, vans, tractors, trucks, and some other normal vehicles. At the front of the motorcade was a giant metal machine that looked like a monster roaring viciously every time the engine sounded. At the back of the motorcade was a beast exactly like the first one. These two were the M3s that were previously in the military camp. The two metal beasts pointed their two thick cannons in different directions, while the armed men inside were concerned with controlling the machine guns in the best possible way under the guidance of the experienced operators. Although they still needed practice, temporarily it was the best they could do until they received proper training. Even if in the future mankind changed its weapons, not everything would necessarily have to be changed. For example, they could continue to use the technology of the M3 but make modifications to the armored shell and replace the main cannons with magical weaponry in line with the appearance of the soul record and evolution. Apart from the two M3s, there were also a dozen vehicles mounted with heavy machine guns guarding the buses and the rest of the vehicles in which the survivors were traveling. In the central part, apart from the vehicles in which the survivors were traveling, there were also trucks carrying seemingly nothing. However, if one were to look carefully, one would notice that there were many tiny-sized bodies. If a person were to see this, they would probably laugh, wondering why they were using such large cargo trucks to move something so small. Of course, these small bodies were actually the bodies of the creatures killed by Bai Zemin and the rest before. Although the size had greatly reduced, the weight of each beast had only been halved. After a night of refreshing rest, Bai Zemin awoke and immediately noticed that his injuries had recovered to approximately 20%. This pleasantly surprised him, and once again he realized how terrifying his health stat was as the desire to become more powerful grew within him. After a leisurely breakfast, Bai Zemin gave the direct order to start moving to leave the forest. Although he did not believe there was a second beast similar to the second-order bear, it was better to be safe than sorry. In his current condition, if another such beast appeared, he would be forced to flee for his life, leaving everything behind if he wanted to survive. While Shangguan Bing Shui was in charge of reducing the size of the monsters with the weapon infinite reduction, Wu Yijuan had informed Bai Zemin that the task of collecting the unclassified soul stones had been successfully completed, but that they still needed some time to make a full count. After this, while the survivors carried the bodies of the unclassified beasts to the trucks, the stronger and more evolved ones, like Bai Zemin himself, Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, Kai Jingyi, Zhong De, etc., worked as a team with the tractors to drag the giant first-order beasts, now reduced in size and weighing half of the original. It was only then that they finally left the forest. Although the military base was large and its facilities were good, staying in the middle of a forest was by no means a good idea. Bai Zemin did not even think of something so stupid as to move his base to a place as dangerous as that, so without hesitation, he ordered to leave immediately when everything was done. Several hundred weapons such as machine guns, pistols, rifles, grenades, shotguns, and so on, with boxes and boxes of orange, green, yellow, blue color, were carried by the heavy trucks and filled to the brim with ammunition. Because the noise that more than 30 vehicles made while moving was too great, it was simply impossible not to attract the attention of some wild beast or creature roaming around. Therefore, in the middle of the road, they encountered some enemies that assaulted the convoy with the intention of feasting on flesh and blood. Unfortunately for these creatures, even before they could do anything interesting about it, a rain of bullets rained down on them and filled their bodies with holes, leaving them in a miserable and unrecognizable state. The men armed to the teeth on the different vehicles did not even let the drivers press the brakes and, taking advantage of the volume of bullets, took it upon themselves to liquidate any nearby enemy. Even if many of them missed, under such a torrent of bullets it was simply impossible to 100% not hit. Although a large amount of ammunition could have been saved if Bai Zemin simply ordered the vehicles to stop and let Kai Jingyi or someone else take over the task, this would in turn consume more time than simply firing wildly without slowing down the vehicles. At this point, Bai Zemin and the other leaders had already fully accepted that human weaponry would eventually become ineffective. Therefore, expending ammunition no longer became too painful for any of them. In turn, what they lacked was precisely time. Therefore, no one said anything about it. Of course, this did not mean that Bai Zemin would allow bullets to be senselessly wasted. It was just that at this moment he wanted more than anyone else to get to the village to receive magical medical treatment and start working on important things that concerned his personal strength and even that of all those under his flag. Due to the increase in vehicles, the time needed to reach the beginning village was a total of 12 solid hours, in which the drivers had to be replaced once midway to avoid any kind of incidents. When the motorcade crossed the main entrance of the village, it was already a little after 5 p.m., but the sun was still burning high in the sky. What is that? Tank. You idiot, that's not a tank. That's AM3. Amazing. So many powerful guns. Long live the leader. Long live the leaders. When the armed convoy arrived at the central square of the village where all the survivors under the command of Bai Zemin were gathered, the people there were surprised beyond words. Many of them failed to recognize what kind of vehicles the M3 IFVs were, thinking they were tanks. But others who had a little more military knowledge recognized this type of vehicle that was sold to the whole world as one of the best of its kind. The eyes of the survivors shone with relief when they saw the soldiers armed to the teeth descending from the vehicles, looking powerful and intimidating. None of them feared being abused anymore. As long as they followed the rules, everything would be fine. The more power Bai Zemin gained, the safer the survivors felt and the more relieved they felt leaving their lives in his hands. While the soldiers were unloading the boxes with guns and ammunition into what had now become a forbidden zone that unauthorized personnel was not allowed to enter, and if they broke this rule, they could even be executed immediately, Bai Zemin looked for Kong Lan immediately. Inside the main villa. My God. The young mage covered her mouth in shock when she saw Bai Zemin's miserable condition. Since she had started following Bai Zemin's footsteps, this was the first time she had seen him in such a bad condition. His wounds might not be life-threatening, but they were undoubtedly far from minor injuries. She was even amazed at the willpower he must have had to keep his face from showing the pain he was probably suffering inside. Seeing Kong Lan's frightened and worried expression, Bai Zemin did not know whether to laugh or cry. Kong Lan, hurry up and heal him at once. Kai Jingyi sounded a little upset to see her just standing still without moving her hands. This was strange, considering she was usually shy and quiet, which showed how much Bai Zemin's health was important to her. This was also normal, considering that Kai Jingyi was his loyal follower. The trust between the two had reached an extremely high level, and her dependence on him had also increased a notch. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 199 Monstrous Recovery. Hearing Kai Jingyi's voice and the urgent tone in which she spoke, Kong Lan finally came back to her senses. She looked at Bai Zemin and asked a little worriedly, Are you all right? Do you have a particularly serious injury that you want me to treat for you? Kong Lan simply didn't know how to react. To her, Bai Zemin was a supreme and invincible existence. In the past, no matter what kind of enemy it was or how strong it was, he always emerged victorious with overwhelming strength. However, seeing him with such wounds made her realize that he, like her, was a human being. This thought unconsciously made Kong Lan also realize that as a human, Bai Zemin must be feeling a great deal of weight on his shoulders. With the lives of nearly 2,000 people weighing on his back, as well as the constant concern for food and safety, could definitely cause him to collapse one day if he was not helped. Unaware of the thoughts of the woman in front of him, Bai Zemin shook his head and sat down on the couch as he slowly said, "Just heal my left arm. Use your lesser healing skill both times on my arm." "On your arm?" Kong Lan repeated while looking at the wound on his face. She wanted to say something but soon understood the thoughts of the man in front of her and couldn't help but bite her lips as a complicated glint flashed in her dark eyes. The reason why Bai Zemin chose his arm over any other part of his body, even ignoring the pain he felt due to his broken ribs, was most likely because he wanted to be able to use as much of his strength as quickly as possible again. If a powerful enemy appeared, even if he had 2 or 3 broken ribs, Bai Zemin could face them as long as he had his 2 arms and 2 legs in perfect condition. However, with his left arm out of action, his total strength was naturally much less than normal. At this realization, Kong Lan exchanged glances with Kai Jingyi before starting to move the mana in her body by pushing it with all her magic. Her hands glowed with a faint white radiance as she carefully activated her first-order lesser healing skill. Kong Lan's lesser healing skill was originally a first-order active skill level 1. But little by little, she was fulfilling the requirements to evolve the skill, and together with the acquisition of some soul stones, the level of her skill had been raised from 1 to 4 in a short time. Now, first-order lesser healing level 4 was 15% more effective than in the past. This, coupled with Bai Zemin's high health stat as well as the passive bonus of his superhuman health skill, which increased the healing he received by 20%, the results were astonishing. After the first activation, when the first orb of white light went into his left arm, Bai Zemin felt all the broken bones seemed to twist at speeds that were simply too dazzling. He felt as if a drill was constantly piercing his skin, and the pain alone was enough to make 90% of the people howl like ghosts. 10 minutes later, when the effect of the first magic healing orb ended, Kong Lan once again cast lesser healing on the same spot as before. Crack, crack, crack. The cracking sound spread through the silent room, causing Kai Jingyi and Kong Lan's hair to stand on end. The only person who maintained a composed expression, other than Bai Zemin himself, was Lilith in her human form. Lilith observed everything, every detail in Bai Zemin's expression, and noticed that occasionally his resolute eyes hesitated. That was when she realized that he was in a lot of pain, but by pure willpower he was barely enduring it. But how could he not be in pain? Almost a month ago, he was just a normal human being. It was just that Lilith had unconsciously not treated Bai Zemin as a human equal to the rest. At times, she even forgot that he was just a lower existence of the first order. 10 minutes after the second magic orb began to work inside his body, the white glow that illuminated Bai Zemin's left arm slowly dimmed until it disappeared completely. Feeling the arm still somewhat stiff, Bai Zemin stood up and, to the surprise of his 2 loyal followers, he began to move his left arm back and forth casually. He even punched the void in front of him several times naturally. "You, leader, your arm healed completely?" Kong Lan exclaimed in shock as she looked at him in disbelief. She had previously touched Bai Zemin's left arm. Naturally she felt how his bones had broken into several pieces each. She estimated that it would take at least 3 or 4 more sessions to heal it in its entirety. Little did she expect that after a single shot, with the 2 activations of her lesser healing skill, all of his bones came back together again. Seeing how he moved like this, it seemed as if his previous fractures were nothing more than illusions. Kai Jingyi's eyes lit up brightly as she looked at him with adoration. Recovering from more than 20 fractures in such a short time. Who else besides him could do something like that? Kai Jingyi was sure that even the second most powerful person in the entire group, Shangguan Bing Shui, was not capable of such a thing. The only one who did not seem surprised was Lilith. She knew Bai Zemin's current stats as well as all of his skills after all. Bai Zemin chuckled and revealed with a hint of pride in his voice, "My health stat is close to 300 points, so my recovery rate is almost 30 times faster than a particularly healthy person before the arrival of the soul record on Earth. I also have a passive skill that boosts all the healing I receive by 20%. Kong Lan and Kai Jingyi gasped as they heard that their health had almost reached 300 points. Kong Lan's health stat was barely 57 points, and although Kai Jingyi was a little better at 87 points, she still couldn't compare to him. It was only then that the two realized that they were simply too far behind him and that if they wanted to be of any use to him and not hinder him in the future, they would have to work much harder. Both women looked at each other and saw the same glint of resolve in each other's eyes. This was the first time Bai Zemin told another living being about his stats other than Lilith, and the only reason he did this was because he knew that the 2 women in front of him would not reveal anything to anyone. After all, for better or worse, they were under the passive effect of the skill attached to his lower leader subclass. I suppose with another 3 more sessions you'll be able to return to your max condition. Lily stood up and approached him with a happy smile. I think so. Bai Zemin nodded as he looked at her with shining eyes. Kong Lan, Kai Jingyi. Listen carefully. He looked at them with a serious expression and revealed his plans for the next few days. Hearing what he said, both women's eyes shone with intense fervor. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 200 Factions, Lower Existences and Higher Existences. It was past 6 o'clock in the afternoon and little by little the sun was beginning to lose its power. Although it still shone high in the sky, the temperatures were beginning to drop at speeds that would be noticeable to anyone, and that bright golden yellow that characterized it so much was slowly becoming faint until it took on a slight orange tinge. The beginning village consisted of a secure perimeter of at least 10 kilometers around, with the village itself as the center. In this perimeter, the probability of a survivor encountering any kind of mutated creature or zombie was especially low, since Fu Xiefeng and the rest had worked hard to wipe out any kind of latent danger. Still, it was simply impossible to prevent the occasional wild animal or zombie from sneaking in. After all, to prevent such a thing from happening would require a large armed manpower guarding the perimeter day and night. Such a thing was simply impossible at present. To avoid unnecessary deaths, the survivors, who now numbered almost 2,000 in total, only lived in the houses near the middle perimeter. Although they were still on the outside, since they were only normal citizens. The normal citizens, those who did not want to do any kind of risky work or use their strength to earn their meals, were the minority inside the village. The majority were noble citizens willing to work, so they occupied the middle perimeter. Under such a protective regime, unless someone ignored the established rules and wandered too far, casualties were practically zero. To further secure the surroundings, Chen He, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Kong Lan took over 100 noble citizens with construction experience or strong bodies to do heavy work before heading to the outer perimeter of the settlement. Under the care of 3 powerful fighters and more than 70 armed soldiers, some survivors began to dig 2 or 3 meter deep holes, while others carried large tree trunks or sturdy wooden planks. Little by little, a rustic but firm wooden wall with a height of 6 to 7 meters was erected. Meanwhile, Bai Zemin was currently inside a building at the back of his villa. The beds and furniture that had previously occupied it had been removed in their entirety. Several walls had been knocked down, leaving only a huge living room with over 100 square meters of space that was now filled with many strange objects that had replaced the previous furniture and appliances. Tongs, a fireplace, hammers of all kinds, different-sized anvils, large work tables, etc. All kinds of tools hung on the walls or rested on neatly arranged shelves on the sides. In a corner one could see all kinds of large pelts hung up and stretched by various ropes. In addition, in another corner were several mountains of objects of different sizes that seemed to shimmer with a metallic touch in the glare of sunlight coming through the large solar window in the ceiling. Not bad. They did a good job here. Xietain walked over to the pelts and touched them to check that they were dry as he commented casually, "Will you start working now?" Lilith asked. She was in her natural form as she rested comfortably on one of the work tables and looked at Xietan's back with a small smile on her lips. Xietain waved his left arm several times before nodding, "That's right. I need to urgently start working on the pelts or they will start to go bad as time goes by. Even the world's mana can't beat decay, can it? Lilith agreed. The power of time still reigns supreme, and only when one reaches the fifth order can one become immune to the decay of the river of life that flows endlessly. Fifth order. Xietain paused for a moment. After considering for a moment, he asked tentatively, "After you reach the fifth order is when you become what you call higher existence?" Lilith did not hide it and nodded calmly. She explained in an indifferent voice, "Putting aside unclassified existences, from first order to fourth order, no matter how strong an existence is, it will eventually die. This is an absolute fact. While the life expectancy between a first order existence and a fourth order existence is completely different, at the end of the day, they all end up turning to ashes. These existences that fail to defeat the passage of time are called lower existences by the higher existences." Xietain remained silent. He finally understood many things. The term lower existence was not meant to offend anyone. It was just that from the point of view of those who managed to defeat the time, they were special beings, different from the rest. That was why they differentiated between lower and higher. Xietain wanted to ask what level he needed to reach the fifth order, but in the end he decided not to ask that question. He was just a miserable first order level 40 existence. What was the use of asking a question that would probably only end up depressing him when he knew the answer? Xietain believed it was better to focus on what was ahead of him rather than looking so far ahead. Of course, this didn't mean that he was neglecting the future. It was just that there were things beyond his reach that he didn't need to worry about. Regardless of whether it was a powerful higher existence or whether it was a mere level 100 lower existence, all of them could crush Xietain with one hand. This was an undeniable fact. Therefore, there was no difference between one or the other for him. Still, he decided to ask one more question. A question that would not make him feel overwhelmed but would at least give him some clues about the general situation of the universe as a whole. "Can you tell me how many factions of higher existences exist?" Xietain was not an enemy of any of these factions. At least not yet. Therefore, he was not concerned about them, whether one existed or thousands existed, such things had nothing to do with him figuratively. Lilith thought about it for a moment, tilting her head to the ceiling and gazing up at the sky through the light breaker. She looked like a celestial goddess illuminated by the rays of the sunset. Just when Xietain thought she wasn't going to respond, she answered somewhat unsure of herself, "I'm not too sure. There are probably more hidden beings, but to my knowledge and probably to most, the number of factions of higher existences that currently exist are 8. Lilith then listed them one by one. The army of heaven, led by the god of the Bible. The demonic army, led by Lucifer or Satan. Dragon god kingdom, led by the dragon monarch. Immortal bloodlust, led by the vampire king. Endless crimson flame, led by the eternal phoenix. The heavenly moon army, led by the wolf emperor. The army of evolution, led by the zombie ancestor. Devourers and destroyers, led by a beast who calls itself Star Devourer.